She wore the same navy blue uniform every morning, same worn boots, same faded jacket with Millbrook School District stitched above the pocket. The keys to Bus 47 jingled in her hand as she walked through the depot at 6:30 a.m., just like she had for the past 3 years. Nobody looked twice. Nobody asked questions. To everyone in Millbrook, she was just Tiffany Davis, the quiet woman who drove their kids to school. But 15 years ago, Tiffany had been someone else entirely. The October morning was crisp and clear as Tiffany performed her pre-trip inspection. She checked the tires, tested the lights, and made sure the emergency exits worked properly. These simple routines had become her anchor to a normal life, far from the world she used to know. Her hands moved with the same methodical precision she had once used to check diving equipment. Every gauge, every warning light, every safety mechanism received the same careful attention she had once given to oxygen tanks and pressure suits. The difference was that now, instead of preparing for a descent into the unknown depths of ancient oceans, she was preparing to transport the most precious cargo imaginable, other people's children. Her first stop was Maple Street, where 8-year-old Emma Martinez waited with her backpack almost as big as she was. Emma always sat in the third row, right side, and always asked the same question. "Miss Tiffany, were you ever scared when you were little?" Tiffany smiled in the rearview mirror. "Everyone gets scared sometimes, Emma. The trick is knowing what to do when you are." If only Emma knew the places where Tiffany had learned that lesson. The underwater caves of Belize, where one wrong turn meant never seeing daylight again. The pitch-black depths, where she had spent hours with only the sound of her own breathing for company, navigating by feel and instinct through passages that had been carved by water over millions of years. The wreck of an ancient Roman ship in the Mediterranean, where equipment failure at 200 feet below the surface had nearly cost her life. She remembered the moment when her primary regulator had malfunctioned, leaving her with only her backup air supply and a long, dangerous ascent to the surface. The archaeological site off the coast of Egypt, where strong currents and poor visibility had made every dive a gamble with death. She had spent weeks mapping the remains of a Ptolemaic harbor, working in conditions where a diver could become disoriented and lost in seconds. But those days were behind her now. She had traded her diving gear for a school bus, her underwater expeditions for suburban streets, her team of fellow archaeologists, for a route full of children who saw her as nothing more than the person who got them safely to school. The second stop was Oak Avenue, where the Henderson twins climbed aboard with their identical lunchboxes and their never-ending argument about who was older by 3 minutes. Mrs. Henderson waved from the doorway, coffee mug in hand, trusting Tiffany with her most precious possessions without even thinking about it. That trust was something Tiffany never took lightly. In her previous career, the stakes had always been about discovery, preservation, scientific advancement. Now the stakes were simpler, but somehow more important. Getting these children to school safely, making sure they felt secure and cared for during the journey, being a steady, reliable presence in their daily lives.
The radio crackled to life. All buses, weather service has issued a flash flood warning for our area. Heavy rains expected through the afternoon. Be aware of road conditions. Tiffany glanced at the sky. Still clear, but she had learned to respect weather warnings. In her previous life, ignoring environmental conditions could be fatal. She had seen divers make fatal mistakes because they ignored storm warnings or tide charts. She had watched archaeological expeditions turn into rescue operations because someone had dismissed a weather report as overly cautious.
The third stop brought Tommy Rodriguez, a 6th grader who played football and always sat in the back, trying to look cool but secretly still excited about riding the bus. Behind him came Sarah Walsh, a quiet 2nd grader who reminded Tiffany painfully of someone she had lost years ago. Sarah always chose a seat near the front, where she could see Tiffany in the rearview mirror, and always whispered, "Thank you," when she got off the bus. By noon, the sky had turned dark gray. Tiffany sat in the driver's lounge at the school, watching the weather radar on her phone. The red and orange blobs were moving fast toward Millbrook, and they looked serious. She pulled up additional weather data, studying the storm's trajectory and intensity with the same analytical skills she had once applied to oceanographic conditions. During her diving career, she had become an expert at reading weather patterns, understanding how surface conditions affected underwater visibility and currents. A storm system like this one could change everything in a matter of hours. "Looks nasty out there," said Bob Henderson, another driver who had been with the district for 20 years. Bob was a good man, a former construction worker who had taken the job after a back injury ended his building career. He cared about the kids just as much as Tiffany did, but he didn't have her background in emergency response. "Haven't seen rain like this predicted since the big flood of '98, Bob continued, settling into the plastic chair next to hers. Tiffany nodded, remembering what she had read about that flood when she first moved to Millbrook. The Millbrook River had overflowed its banks, washing out roads and forcing evacuations. 3 people had died, including a child who had been swept away while trying to cross a flooded street. The old stone bridge on River Road had barely held, with water rushing just inches below the roadway. "You worried about the afternoon run?" Bob asked. "Always am," Tiffany replied. It was true, though not for the reasons Bob might think. She worried about her kids every day, but today felt different. Her instincts, sharpened by years of diving in dangerous conditions, were telling her to pay attention. She had learned to trust those instincts. They had kept her alive in situations where equipment failed, where weather turned deadly, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. In the underwater world, you developed a sixth sense about danger, an ability to read subtle signs that others might miss. The rain started at 12:45 p.m., light at first, then building to a steady downpour. By 1:30, it was coming down harder than Tiffany had seen since moving to Millbrook. The parking lot outside the school was already showing signs of poor drainage, with water pooling near the storm drains. She walked to the window and watched the rain, noting the intensity and the way the wind was driving it almost horizontally. This wasn't just a heavy shower. This was the kind of weather system that could overwhelm infrastructure, turn streets into rivers, make the familiar suddenly dangerous. By 2:30, when the buses lined up for dismissal, it was coming down in sheets. The storm drains were already struggling to keep up, and water was beginning to flow across some of the lower-lying streets. Tiffany walked through the rain to bus 47, her jacket quickly soaking through. She had dealt with worse conditions underwater, where rain was the least of your worries. But this felt different. The intensity was building too fast, and she could see that the ground was already saturated. She performed her pre-trip inspection even more carefully than usual, checking the brakes, testing the windshield wipers, making sure all the emergency equipment was in place and functional. She had learned never to assume that equipment would work when you needed it most. 23 children climbed aboard bus 47 that afternoon, shaking water from their raincoats and chattering about the storm. The bus felt different with all of them on board, louder and more energetic than usual. Some were excited by the dramatic weather, pressing their faces to the windows to watch the rain. Others seemed nervous, perhaps picking up on the tension that Tiffany was trying hard to conceal. Emma Martinez took her usual seat in the third row, right side, pressing her face to the window to watch the rain. "This is like a waterfall," she said, her breath fogging the glass. "It's really coming down," Tiffany agreed, adjusting her mirrors and checking her emergency radio. She had positioned the radio where she could reach it quickly if needed, a habit from her diving days when communication equipment could mean the difference between a successful rescue and a tragedy. Tommy Rodriguez sprawled across the back seat, trying to look unimpressed by the weather, but clearly fascinated by the intensity of the storm. "My dad says this is nothing compared to Hurricane Bob," he announced to anyone who would listen. Sarah Walsh sat quietly in her usual spot near the front, watching Tiffany in the rearview mirror with the kind of trust that made Tiffany's chest tight with responsibility. Tiffany began her route, driving more slowly than usual. The windshield wipers were working overtime, and even with them on full speed, visibility was poor. She could barely see 50 feet ahead, and the familiar landmarks of her route were obscured by the heavy rain. She took the turns carefully, feeling the weight of her responsibility more acutely than usual. In her diving career, when things went wrong, she had usually been responsible only for herself and her diving partner. Now she had 23 children depending on her to make the right decisions. The first few stops went smoothly, despite the weather. Parents came running out with umbrellas to collect their children, some waving gratefully to Tiffany as they hurried toward their houses. She could see the relief on their faces as they gathered their kids safely inside. But as she continued along her route, the conditions continued to deteriorate. The streets were flooding now, with water running across the pavement in several places. She had to detour around one low-lying intersection where the water was already 6 inches deep. The radio crackled again. "All buses, be advised that River Road is experiencing flooding. Avoid if possible." River Road was part of Tiffany's regular route. It was also the most direct path to get the remaining 12 children home. She could take the long way around, adding 20 minutes to the trip through residential streets that were also beginning to flood. Or she could stick to her regular route and cross the old stone bridge that had weathered every storm for over a century. She thought about the children still on the bus. Most of them had been traveling since 7 in the morning. They were tired, hungry, and eager to get home. Some of the younger ones were beginning to get anxious about the storm. The stone bridge over the Millbrook River had stood for over a century. It had survived the flood of 1998, the hurricane of 1991, countless smaller storms. The town engineers inspected it regularly. It was built to last. She made the turn onto River Road. River Road followed the course of the Millbrook River for about 2 miles before reaching the bridge. Normally, it was one of the most scenic parts of Tiffany's route, with the river meandering peacefully through a corridor of old oak trees. The children always enjoyed this section, often spotting ducks or herons along the riverbank. Today, the scene was dramatically different. The river had risen far above its normal banks, and the water was brown and angry, carrying debris and moving fast. Trees that normally stood well back from the water's edge were now partially submerged. The peaceful stream had become a raging torrent. "Whoa," Tommy said from the back, pressing his face to the window. "Look at all that water." Tiffany could hear the nervousness creeping into the children's voices as they saw the flooding around them. She kept her own voice calm and steady. "It's just a lot of rain," she said. "The river will go back to normal once the storm passes." But privately, she was calculating risks with the methodical precision she had learned underwater. The approach to the bridge was still clear, though water was beginning to flow across the lower sections of the road. The bridge itself looked solid, its stone foundations deeply rooted in bedrock that had been there for millions of years. She had crossed this bridge thousands of times. She knew every inch of it, every slight irregularity in the roadway, every characteristic sound the bus made as it passed over the stone surface. Her children trusted her to get them home safely, and she had never failed them. But she also remembered her diving training. When in doubt, err on the side of caution. She had seen too many accidents happen because someone ignored their instincts, pushed forward when they should have turned back. She slowed the bus to a crawl and reached for her radio. "Dispatch, this is Bus 47. I'm approaching the River Road Bridge. Water levels are high, but the bridge appears stable. Request permission to proceed." The radio crackled for a moment before the dispatcher responded. "Bus 47, you're authorized to use your judgment. If you don't feel safe, take the alternate route." Tiffany looked at the bridge again. The water was higher than she had ever seen it, rushing and turbulent, but still several feet below the bridge deck. The stone structure looked as solid as ever, unmoved by the chaos flowing beneath it. She pressed gently on the accelerator and started across. The first sign of trouble was a vibration. Not the normal rumble of the bus engine, but something else, something coming from below. Tiffany felt it through the steering wheel, through the seat, through her bones. In her diving career, she had learned to pay attention to such subtle warnings. The slight change in the sound of her breathing apparatus that might indicate a malfunction. The barely perceptible shift in water temperature that could signal dangerous currents ahead. The tiny vibration in a dive line that might mean the anchor was dragging. She was halfway across the bridge when she heard the crack. It wasn't loud, not over the sound of the rain and the river, but Tiffany's ears were trained to notice changes in her environment. Underwater, the smallest sound could mean the difference between life and death. A crack in a cave ceiling, the groan of a ship's hull under pressure, the whistle of escaping air from damaged equipment. She knew that sound. Something was failing. "Everyone hold on," she called to the children, trying to keep her voice calm. "We're going to—" The bridge gave way. Not all at once, but in a slow, terrifying collapse that started at the center and worked its way out. The ancient stones, weakened by decades of weather and overwhelmed by the unprecedented flood, finally surrendered to forces they could no longer resist. The roadway tilted beneath them, and Tiffany felt the bus beginning to slide sideways toward the raging water below. She had perhaps 3 seconds to react, 3 seconds to make decisions that would determine whether 23 children lived or died. Her diving training took over. In emergency situations underwater, there was no time for panic, no time for second guessing. You assessed the situation, identified your options, and acted with decisive precision. She yanked the wheel hard to the right, trying to keep the bus on the remaining solid section of the bridge. For a moment, it seemed like it might work. The bus lurched back toward the center of the roadway, but the collapse was accelerating now, and there was nowhere left to go. Bus 47 tilted forward, then sideways, then tumbled into the raging waters of the Millbrook River. The world turned upside down in seconds. Tiffany felt the familiar sensation of weightlessness as the bus left the bridge, followed immediately by the jarring impact as it hit the water. The children's screams filled the air, a sound that cut through her professional calm like nothing in her previous career ever had. The bus hit the water hard, throwing everyone forward against their seatbelts. Water immediately began pouring in through the windows, which had shattered on impact. The safety glass held together in spiderweb patterns, but it couldn't keep out the rushing river. Tiffany felt the familiar sensation of being underwater, but this time was different. This time she wasn't wearing a wetsuit and breathing apparatus. This time she wasn't alone with a trained diving partner. This time she had 23 children depending on her, and most of them couldn't swim well enough to save themselves. This was what she had trained for, though not in the way she had ever imagined. All those years diving in dangerous conditions, all those emergency situations underwater, all those times when staying calm meant staying alive. Her body remembered what to do even if her mind was struggling to process the situation. "Emma," she called to the little girl in the third row, "remember what I told you about being scared?" Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face, water now up to her waist. You know what to do, right? Another nod. Good. I need you to help me. Can you do that? The water was rising rapidly now, reaching their chests. Some of the smaller children could barely keep their heads above it. Tiffany knew she had maybe 2 minutes before the bus was completely flooded, but she also knew that panic would kill them faster than the water would. She had seen it happen in diving accidents, people who forgot their training, who let fear override their preparation, who made fatal mistakes because they couldn't think clearly under pressure. Tiffany unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up in the aisle, water swirling around her waist. The bus was settling on the river bottom, but she could feel it shifting with the current, unstable and likely to roll over at any moment. I'm going to get you out of here, she told the children, but I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say. She pushed through the water to the back of the bus, fighting against the current that was trying to knock her off balance. Her legs remembered how to move efficiently underwater, how to use the resistance to her advantage rather than fighting against it. The emergency exit in the back of the bus was underwater now, but the roof hatch was still accessible. This was the same kind of problem-solving she had done countless times in her archaeological work, finding alternative exits when the planned route was blocked, improvising solutions with whatever resources were available. The roof hatch was designed to be opened from inside in emergencies. Tiffany had practiced this procedure hundreds of times during her training, but never in actual flood conditions. The mechanism was simple, but required significant force to operate. She turned the handle and pushed. The hatch opened, and she could see gray sky above, rain still falling hard. The top of the bus was just barely above the waterline. Okay, everyone, she called. We're going up to the roof. The biggest kids first, then they're going to help the smaller ones. This was underwater archaeology in reverse. Instead of going down to explore ancient wrecks, she was bringing everyone up to safety. The principles were the same. Stay calm, move efficiently, help your team, never leave anyone behind. Tommy Rodriguez, the sixth grader who played football, was in the back seat. His usual teenage bravado had been replaced by genuine fear, but he was trying to be brave. Tommy, you first. Climb up through the hatch. Tommy was strong and athletic, but he was also scared and disoriented. Tiffany helped boost him up through the opening, making sure he had a secure grip before letting go. Now help the others, she called as Tommy emerged into the rain. One by one, she boosted the children up through the hatch. The older ones helped pull the younger ones to safety. It was like running a dive operation in reverse, bringing artifacts up from the depths, except these artifacts were alive and terrified and depending on her for their survival. The water inside the bus continued to rise. It was up to her chest now, and some of the smaller children could barely keep their heads above it. She had to work faster. Sarah, you're next, she called to the quiet second grader. Sarah was small and light, but she was also frightened almost into paralysis. Tiffany had to practically lift her bodily through the hatch, talking to her constantly, keeping her focused on the sound of her voice rather than the chaos around them. That's it, Sarah. Just like climbing a jungle gym, Tommy's going to help you. One by one, the children disappeared through the hatch. Emma Martinez was one of the last. When Tiffany lifted her toward the opening, the little girl looked back at her with eyes that seemed much older than 8 years. What about you, Miss Tiffany? I'll be right behind you. I promise. But as soon as Emma disappeared through the hatch, Tiffany felt the bus shift. The current had been working against the vehicle's position on the riverbed, and now it won. The bus rolled over, and suddenly, the roof hatch was underwater. The bus was sinking fast, pulled down by its weight and the strong current. Water was rising inside, already up to the seat level. The children were screaming, crying, panicking, some trying to unbuckle their seatbelts, while others sat frozen in terror. But Tiffany was calm. For the first time in 3 years, she was in her element. "Listen to me," she shouted over the noise of rushing water. "Everyone listen to my voice." She had done this before, in different circumstances, but with the same life or death urgency. When diving equipment failed at depth, when cave-ins trapped team members, when underwater emergencies required instant response and absolute calm. The key was to become the stable center around which everything else could organize. Some of the children turned toward her, their eyes wide with terror. "I need you to take a deep breath and hold it. Can you do that for me?" Tiffany found herself trapped inside the overturned bus, with no way out except through the submerged passenger compartment. The hatch that had been her escape route was now 15 feet underwater, and the current was too strong to swim against. She had been in situations like this before. Cave diving was full of moments when you suddenly found yourself cut off from your planned exit route. The key was not to panic, not to waste oxygen, not to make the situation worse by moving frantically. She floated in the air pocket that remained in what had been the front of the bus, now turned upside down. The space was getting smaller as water continued to seep in. She had maybe 5 minutes of air left, possibly less, but the children were safe. That was what mattered. She could hear voices shouting above her, muffled by the water and the overturned bus. The kids were calling her name, screaming for help. She could picture them standing on the overturned bus in the rain, terrified that they had lost their driver. She had to get out. Not for herself, but for them. They needed to see that she was okay. They needed to know that their trust in her had been justified. Tiffany took a deep breath of the increasingly stale air and dove down into the flooded bus. Swimming through the submerged interior was like navigating a flooded cave system. Debris floated everywhere. Backpacks, lunchboxes, papers, books. The seats created obstacles that could trap her if she wasn't careful. But this was familiar territory. She had spent years swimming through tight spaces underwater, finding her way in poor visibility, managing her air supply in dangerous situations. She had explored sunken ships where one wrong turn could mean getting lost in a maze of twisted metal and corroded passages. She swam toward where she thought a window might be. Most of the glass was gone, shattered in the crash, but the openings were barely large enough for a person to fit through. She would have to be careful not to cut herself on the jagged edges. The current was strong even inside the bus, trying to push her deeper into the submerged compartment. She had to fight against it while navigating through the obstacle course of floating debris. She found a window opening and squeezed through, feeling metal scrape against her jacket. For a moment she was stuck, wedged between the bus and the riverbed. But she twisted her body the way she had learned in tight underwater passages and broke free. The current immediately grabbed her. This wasn't like diving in calm, controlled conditions. This was like being caught in a riptide, or fighting your way out of an underwater cave when the tide changed unexpectedly. She let the current carry her downstream for a few seconds, conserving energy while she assessed the situation. Fighting directly against the flow would exhaust her quickly. Instead, she needed to angle across it, using the same techniques she had learned for dealing with strong underwater currents. Her lungs were burning, but she had held her breath for longer than this during many deep dives. The key was not to panic, not to waste energy thrashing around, but to swim with purpose and efficiency. She angled toward the surface, kicking hard but smoothly, using the long, powerful strokes that had carried her safely through countless dangerous situations. When she broke the surface, gasping and coughing, she could hear the children screaming her name. The sound gave her strength, reminding her why she had to survive this. "I'm okay," she shouted over the sound of the rushing water. "Stay where you are." But staying where they were wasn't going to work for long. The overturned bus was unstable, rolling slightly in the current, and the water was still rising. She could see that some of the children were having trouble maintaining their footing on the slippery, curved surface. Tiffany looked around, assessing the situation the way she had been trained to do underwater. The riverbank was about 50 feet away, but the current was strong and the children couldn't swim that distance. She needed another solution. There were trees along the shore, their branches hanging over the water. One particularly large oak had a thick branch that extended well out over the river, hanging low enough that she might be able to reach it. She had an idea. It was risky, but she had built her career on calculated risks. Swimming against the current, Tiffany made her way to the largest oak tree she could see. Its branches extended well out over the river, and one thick limb hung low enough that she could grab it with a good jump. This was like the recovery work she had done on underwater archaeological sites. Sometimes you had to improvise, use whatever materials were available, work with the environment instead of against it. She had rigged countless makeshift systems for lifting artifacts from the ocean floor, using natural features and creative engineering to solve problems that had no textbook solutions. She grabbed the branch and pulled herself up, water streaming from her clothes. The branch held her weight easily. It was old and thick, probably strong enough to support several people. From here, she could see the situation more clearly. The bus was continuing to drift downstream, but slowly. The children were bunched together on the highest part of the overturned vehicle, trying to stay out of the water. They looked cold and terrified, but they were following her instructions to stay together. Emergency sirens were wailing in the distance. Help was coming, but not fast enough. She could see that the bus was becoming less stable with each passing minute, and some of the smaller children were having trouble holding on. Tiffany looked at the branch she was holding, then at the other branches around her. The tree was old and strong, with limbs extending in different directions. If she could create some kind of rope or line, she took off her jacket and tied one sleeve to the branch above her. Then she took off her belt and connected it to the other sleeve. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In her archaeological work, she had often had to create rope systems for lowering equipment into underwater sites or hauling artifacts to the surface. "Tommy," she called to the boy on the bus. "Can you swim?" "A little," he called back, his voice shaking. "I need you to jump in and swim toward me. Can you do that?" Tommy looked scared, but he was also the oldest and biggest of the kids still on the bus. If anyone could make it, he could. "I'll catch you," Tiffany promised. This was like directing a dive operation, giving instructions to team members who were scared but had to trust her judgment. She had done it before when equipment failed, when team members panicked, when split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. Tommy took a deep breath and jumped. The current immediately carried him downstream, but he was swimming hard toward the tree. Tiffany stretched as far as she could, still holding onto the branch with one hand. Their fingers touched, then gripped. She pulled him toward the tree trunk with strength she didn't know she still had. "Can you climb?" she asked. He nodded, though he was shaking from cold and fear. Together they made it to the bank. "Now we do it again," Tiffany said. The next hour became a blur of desperate activity. One by one, Tiffany talked the children through jumping into the water and swimming toward her. Some were stronger swimmers than others. The smaller ones she had to go after herself, diving back into the river and bringing them to safety. Each rescue was like a dive operation. Assess the situation, plan the approach, execute with precision, manage the risks. The difference was that instead of recovering ancient artifacts, she was saving lives. Marcus, a 6-year-old who could barely swim, required her to go all the way out to the bus. She tied her makeshift rope around her waist and swam out to get him, fighting the current every foot of the way. When she reached the bus, It was clear that it wouldn't remain stable much longer. "Marcus, I'm going to put this around you," she said, showing him the belt she had fashioned into a harness. "Then we're going to swim together. All you have to do is hold on to me." The little boy was terrified, but he trusted her completely. That trust was both heartbreaking and inspiring, a reminder of the responsibility she carried every day, magnified 1,000-fold by the crisis. The swim back to shore with Marcus was the longest of her life. He was small but seemed impossibly heavy in the water, and the current kept trying to pull them downstream. She had to use every technique she had learned in water rescue training, plus some she improvised on the spot. By the time she got him to safety, her arms were burning with exhaustion, but there were still children on the bus. Emma was one of the last. When Tiffany pulled her from the water, the little girl was barely conscious from cold and exhaustion. "I knew you'd come back," Emma whispered. "I promised, didn't I?" 4 children remained on the bus when the first responders finally arrived. The fire department's water rescue team was setting up their equipment, but Tiffany could see it would take time. The children on the bus were getting colder and more frightened with each passing minute, and the vehicle was becoming increasingly unstable. "Ma'am, please step back," one of the firefighters said to her as she prepared to make another trip to the bus. "We've got this under control." Tiffany looked at the rescue setup. They were good at what they did, professional and well-trained, but they were working with standard procedures for standard situations. This wasn't standard. "Those kids have been in the water for almost an hour," she said. "They're going into hypothermia. You don't have time for a by-the-book rescue." The fire captain looked at her sharply. "Are you qualified to make that assessment?" Tiffany hesitated. She had managed to keep her past secret for 3 years. Everyone in Millbrook thought she was just a bus driver. But sometimes secrets had to be broken when lives were at stake. "I'm a certified commercial diver," she said. "Deep water, hazardous conditions. I've done emergency extractions before." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough truth for right now. She could see the calculation in the captain's eyes as he weighed her qualifications against his protocols. "What do you recommend?" "Let me go get them. I know those kids, and they trust me. I can be there and back in 10 minutes. "That's not protocol. Sometimes protocol gets people killed." It was a harsh thing to say, but it was also true. She had seen too many situations where rigid adherence to procedures cost precious time, where flexibility and adaptation were the difference between success and failure. The captain studied her for a moment, then made his decision. "All right. But you wear our safety gear and you stay in radio contact." They gave her a wetsuit and a safety line, but Tiffany knew she would be faster without them. She had spent years diving in conditions where bulky equipment was more hindrance than help. "I'll be faster without the gear," she said. "Trust me." She slipped back into the river wearing just her regular clothes. The water was cold, but not as cold as some of the places she had dived. The current was strong, but not stronger than the riptides she had fought off the coast of Greece during a particularly challenging underwater excavation. Swimming to the bus took 3 minutes. The 4 remaining children were huddled together on the highest point they could find, which was now only about 2 feet above the water level. The bus was clearly unstable, rocking with each surge of the current. "Miss Tiffany," one of them called as she approached. "We thought you weren't coming back." "I always come back," she said, pulling herself up onto the slippery metal surface. "Now we're going for a swim, This was the hardest part. The children who were left were the youngest and smallest. They couldn't swim well, and they were frightened and cold. She would have to take them one at a time, and the bus might not last long enough for her to get them all. But this was what she had trained for. even if she had never imagined using her skills this way. Every difficult dive, every emergency situation, every moment when she had to stay calm while everything around her was going wrong, it had all been preparation for this. She tied her belt around the waist of the first child, a 6-year-old boy named Marcus. "Hold on to me tight," she told him, "and when I say take a deep breath, you take the biggest breath you can, okay?" Marcus nodded, too scared to speak but trusting her completely. Tiffany slipped back into the water with him, feeling his small arms wrap around her neck. The current tried to pull them downstream, but she angled against it, using the techniques she had learned for navigation underwater. The swim to shore took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of fighting the current, keeping Marcus's head above water, and swimming with the efficiency that had kept her alive in dozens of dangerous situations. She handed him off to the paramedics and immediately went back for the next child. By the time she went back for the 4th child, a 7-year-old girl named Sarah, the bus had shifted again. It was now almost completely submerged, with only a small section of the roof still above water. Sarah was terrified, clinging to a metal protrusion and crying for her mother. This was the same little girl who always whispered "thank you" when she got off the bus, who reminded Tiffany painfully of someone she had lost years ago. "Sarah, look at me," Tiffany called, pulling herself up next to the girl. The metal was slippery and cold, and she had to be careful not to lose her grip. "Do you remember what I told Emma about being scared?" Sarah shook her head, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "I told her that everyone gets scared, but the trick is knowing what to do when you are. Do you know what to do right now?" "No," Sarah whispered. "You trust me." "That's what you do. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, still crying, but meeting Tiffany's eyes. The current was getting stronger as the storm continued to dump rain into the river. The bus groaned and shifted beneath them, metal scraping against the rocky riverbed. They had maybe 2 minutes before it went completely under. Tiffany had handled emergency ascents before, when equipment failed, and she had to get herself and her diving partner to the surface quickly. This was the same principle, just in reverse. She wrapped her arms around Sarah and slipped into the water just as the bus rolled over completely and disappeared beneath the surface. This time, the current was too strong to fight directly. Instead, Tiffany let it carry them downstream while angling toward the shore, using the river's own force to help rather than fighting against it. It was a technique she had learned cave diving, when sometimes the only way out was to let the water flow carry you to where you needed to go. The key was not to panic, not to fight the environment, but to work with it. They reached the bank 50 yards downstream from where the rescue teams were set up. But they were safe. Sarah was unconscious from cold and shock, but she was breathing. Paramedics rushed to meet them as Tiffany carried the little girl up the muddy riverbank. She was exhausted, hypothermic, and running on pure adrenaline. But she had done it. All 23 children were safe. The paramedics wrapped Tiffany in blankets and checked her for injuries, but she refused to go to the hospital until she had seen all 23 children loaded into ambulances. They were cold, scared, and shaken, but they were alive. As she sat in the back of an ambulance, watching the last of the children being driven away, the full weight of what had happened began to settle on her. She had just lived through the kind of emergency she had spent 3 years trying to avoid, a situation where her decisions determined whether people lived or died. But this time felt different from the tragedy that had driven her away from archaeology. This time, everyone had survived. "Ma'am," the fire captain said as she sat wrapped in emergency blankets, "where did you learn to do what you just did?" Tiffany looked at the river, where the emergency vehicle's lights reflected off the dark water. The storm was finally starting to ease, though the river would remain dangerous for hours. "I used to have a different job," she said. "What kind of job?" She sighed. She had kept the secret for 3 years, but secrets that big don't stay buried forever. And after what had just happened, maybe it was time to stop hiding from who she really was. "I was an underwater archaeologist. I spent 15 years diving on shipwrecks and underwater ruins around the world, some of the most dangerous diving conditions you can imagine." The captain stared at her. "And now you drive a school bus?" "Now I drive a school bus." Why? That was the question she had been asking herself for 3 years. Why had she given up a career she loved for a simple, quiet life in a small town? Why had she traded the excitement of discovery for the routine of school runs? "Sometimes you get tired of the danger," she said. "Sometimes you want to do something that matters in a different way." But as she said it, she realized it wasn't entirely true. Today had mattered. What she had done in the river had mattered more than any ancient artifact she had ever recovered. The story made national news within hours. "School bus driver uses archaeological diving skills to save 23 children from flood," was the headline that ran on every major news website. Social media exploded with photos and videos taken by bystanders. Someone had filmed her swimming back and forth between the overturned bus and the shore, rescuing child after child. The footage was grainy and shaky, but it clearly showed her diving into the dangerous current again and again, never hesitating, never giving up. Reporters called the school district looking for more information about Tiffany Davis. What they found surprised everyone. She had a PhD in marine archaeology from MIT. She had led diving expeditions in the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. She had discovered Roman shipwrecks, Mayan cenotes, and prehistoric settlements. She had published papers in academic journals and spoken at conferences around the world. "Because it didn't matter," she said. "My job was to drive children safely to and from school. I didn't need a PhD for that. But surely your experience, your qualifications, made me overqualified to be a school bus driver, according to most people. So I didn't mention them." The reporter looked confused. "But why take such a job in the first place? You could have worked anywhere. Universities, research institutions, private companies." Tiffany was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Have you ever spent 3 days at the bottom of the ocean, in complete darkness, trying to excavate a 2,000-year-old amphora without damaging it, while your air supply runs low and equipment fails around you? No. It's exciting. It's important work. It contributes to human knowledge about our past. It's also incredibly stressful. After 15 years, I was ready for something simpler. Something where I could make a difference in a quieter way." "And did you make a difference?" Tiffany thought about Emma Martinez asking if she had ever been scared, about Tommy Rodriguez being brave enough to jump into the river first, about Sarah trusting her when everything was falling apart. "Yes," she said, "I did." But even as she answered the reporter's questions, Tiffany knew that her quiet life was over. The story was too compelling, too unusual. A world-renowned archaeologist hiding in plain sight as a school bus driver, then using her unique skills to save children's lives. It was the kind of story that would follow her forever. And for the past 3 years, she had been driving bus 47 in Millbrook, Massachusetts. The school superintendent found himself fielding calls from reporters around the world, all wanting to know more about the mysterious bus driver who had turned out to be one of the country's leading underwater archaeologists. "We had no idea," he told one persistent journalist. Her application listed her as having a college degree and a clean driving record. She was overqualified for the position, but she said she wanted to do something different with her life. Dr. Davis, one reporter asked when they finally caught up with her at her small apartment, why didn't you tell anyone about your background? Tiffany was still wearing the clothes the hospital had given her after her own were too damaged to save. She looked tired but calm, the same composure that had gotten her through countless underwater emergencies.
Over the next few days, more details emerged about Tiffany's past. The diving community was small and tight-knit, and word spread quickly about what one of their own had done. Dr. Robert Chen, her former colleague from MIT, called a reporter. "Tiffany was one of the best underwater archaeologists I ever worked with," he said. "She had an instinct for dangerous situations that kept her alive when others might not have made it. But she was also incredibly humble. She never sought recognition for her work." Captain Maria Santos, who had worked with Tiffany on a shipwreck excavation off the coast of Spain, was even more direct. "If my life depended on someone getting me out of an underwater emergency, Tiffany Davis is who I would want doing the rescue. She saved our entire team when we had a cave-in during a dive in 2010. We thought we were going to die, but she found a way out that none of us had seen."
The children's parents began to understand what had really happened that day. This wasn't just a bus driver who happened to be a good swimmer. This was someone whose entire career had been preparation for exactly the kind of emergency that had unfolded. "She risked her life for our kids," said Maria Rodriguez, Tommy's mother, "and she did it like it was just part of the job." But the media attention also brought questions that Tiffany had hoped to avoid forever. A journalist from a diving magazine tracked down the story of why she had left archaeology. It turned out that her last expedition, 3 years ago, had ended in tragedy. She had been leading a team exploring a recently discovered Mayan cenote in Mexico when an underwater earthquake caused a cave-in. 2 of her team members had been trapped in the collapsed passage, cut off from the surface with limited air supply.
Tiffany had spent 8 hours in dangerous conditions, making dive after dive, trying to reach them. The water was murky with sediment stirred up by the collapse. Visibility was near zero, and the passage was unstable. Every dive risked triggering another collapse that could trap or kill her as well. She had saved one team member, Dr. Michael Torres, pulling him unconscious from the wreckage with only minutes of air remaining in his tank. But the other, her research partner and closest friend, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, had died before Tiffany could get to her. "Dr. Davis blamed herself," said Dr. Chen when asked about the incident. "Even though the official investigation found that she had done everything humanly possible, even though she had risked her own life repeatedly trying to save both of them, she felt responsible for Jennifer's death."
The accident report, when reporters finally obtained it, told a different story. It described Tiffany's rescue efforts as extraordinary and beyond the call of duty. It noted that her quick thinking and skilled diving had prevented the incident from becoming a 3-person fatality. The report detailed how she had improvised a complex rope and pulley system to extract Dr. Torres from the collapsed passage, working in near-zero visibility with failing equipment. It described how she had made 17 separate dives over 8 hours, each one risking her own life, before finally reaching her trapped colleagues. But Tiffany had never seen it that way. To her, the report was just words on paper. Jennifer was still dead, and no amount of official commendation could change that. "Is that why you became a bus driver?" a persistent reporter asked, having tracked down the full story of the Mexico incident.
Tiffany sat in her apartment, looking out the window at the ordinary street where she had tried to build an ordinary life. "I became a bus driver because I wanted to take care of people in a way that didn't involve life or death decisions every day. I was tired of having people's lives in my hands." The irony was not lost on anyone that her first real emergency as a bus driver had put 23 lives directly in her hands. "Do you regret leaving archaeology?" "I regret that Jennifer died. I regret that I wasn't fast enough or smart enough to save her, but I don't regret the choice to leave. I needed to find a different way to serve. And now, after what happened yesterday,
Tiffany was quiet for a long moment. Now I realize that you can't run away from who you are. You can change jobs, change locations, change your entire life. But when a crisis comes, you respond with everything you've learned, everything you've experienced. Yesterday, I was a bus driver who happened to know how to dive. But I was also an archaeologist who happened to care about children. The reporter leaned forward. So what's next? Will you go back to archaeology? I don't know. For 3 years, I've been trying to hide from the kind of responsibility I carried in my previous career, but yesterday showed me that responsibility finds you anyway. The question is whether you're ready for it. The children from Bus 47 became local celebrities for a few days, appearing on morning television shows and being interviewed by newspapers. But their perspective on what had happened was different from the adults.
Miss Tiffany always seemed different, Emma Martinez told a reporter during a live television interview. Not bad different, just like she knew things. Like she was really paying attention to everything. The reporter smiled indulgently. What kind of things? Like, she always checked the weather before we left school, and she knew exactly how fast to take every turn. And when kids were being mean to each other, she could see it in her mirror even when they thought she wasn't looking. Tommy Rodriguez was more direct when asked about the rescue. She saved our lives. I don't care what her old job was. She's a hero. But then he added something that made the adults in the room pause.
The thing is, she was already our hero. Every day, she made sure we got to school safe and got home safe. She remembered our names and asked about our families. She helped Marcus with his backpack when he couldn't reach the hook. She let Sarah sit up front when she was scared of the big kids in the back. The interviewer looked confused. But surely yesterday was different? Yesterday was scary, Tommy said seriously. But Miss Tiffany wasn't different. She was exactly the same. She took care of us like she always does. The children's parents organized a ceremony to honor Tiffany, but she initially refused to attend. I was just doing my job, she told the organizers. Your job was to drive the bus, replied Marcus's father. What you did after that was something else entirely. Was it? My job is to get the children safely from point A to point B. That's what I did.
But the community wouldn't be deterred. They held the ceremony anyway, with or without her. Parents, teachers, town officials, and many of the children from Bus 47 gathered in the school auditorium to honor their unlikely hero. Emma Martinez, now something of a celebrity herself after her television appearances, stood at the podium to speak for her classmates. Miss Tiffany taught us that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, she said, reading from a prepared statement, but speaking with the conviction of someone much older than 8. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared. She showed us that every single day, not just the day we went in the river. The applause was thunderous, but Emma wasn't finished. She also taught us that heroes don't always look like heroes. Sometimes they look like regular people doing regular jobs. But when you need them, they're ready.
At the back of the auditorium, unnoticed by most of the crowd, Tiffany slipped in during Emma's speech. She listened as child after child stood up to talk about their bus driver, not as a famous archaeologist or a dramatic rescuer, but as someone who had cared about them every day. She knew I was scared of the bigger kids, said 7-year-old Marcus, so she always made sure I got on the bus first and off the bus last, so I wouldn't get pushed around. When my mom was in the hospital, Miss Tiffany asked about her every day, said 10-year-old Lisa Chen. She remembered things that my teachers forgot. She never got mad when we were loud, added Tommy Rodriguez. She just looked in the mirror and smiled, and somehow that made us want to be quieter.
3 weeks after the flood, Tiffany returned to work. The school district had offered her additional training, a promotion, even a position in their safety department. They had also received numerous offers from other organizations, universities wanting to hire her, research institutions offering positions, television producers wanting to make documentaries about her story. She had turned down all of it. "I'd like to keep driving Bus 47, she told the superintendent, "if that's okay." The superintendent, who had been fielding calls from diving companies and research institutions trying to recruit her, looked puzzled. "Dr. Davis, you could have your pick of positions. Universities, private companies, government agencies. After what you did, you could write your own ticket. Why do you want to keep driving a school bus?" Tiffany thought about the question. 3 weeks ago, she would have said it was because she wanted a simple life, free from the stress and responsibility of her old career. But now she realized it was more complicated than that. "Because those kids need someone who cares about getting them safely home," she said. "Because routine matters. Because small, everyday acts of service are just as important as the big, dramatic ones." Even after what happened? Especially after what happened. The truth was that the flood had taught her something she hadn't expected to learn. She had spent 3 years trying to hide from responsibility, trying to avoid situations where her decisions mattered. But responsibility had found her anyway, and when it did, she had been ready for it. The new Bus 47 was more modern than the old one, with better safety features and updated emergency equipment. Tiffany inspected it carefully on her first day back, checking systems and testing equipment with the thoroughness that had kept her alive underwater. The children who climbed aboard that morning were a mix of her original passengers and some new ones. Word had spread through the community, and several parents had specifically requested that their children be assigned to her route. Emma Martinez took her usual seat in the 3rd row, right side. But her question that morning was different. "Miss Tiffany, what was it like under the water? In your old job, I mean." Tiffany looked in the rearview mirror at the eager faces watching her. These children had been through something traumatic, but they had also learned something important about courage and trust. "It was beautiful," she said, "and dangerous, and exciting, but also very lonely sometimes."
Lonelier than driving a bus? Asked Tommy Rodriguez. Tiffany smiled. Much lonelier. When you're diving, even with a team, you're basically alone with your thoughts and your breathing. Here, I get to talk to you guys every day. I get to know your families, watch you grow up, be part of your lives in a small way. "Do you miss it?" Emma asked. "Sometimes. But I like being here with you guys too." Over the following months, something interesting happened. Instead of returning to her old life, or completely hiding from it, Tiffany found a way to integrate her past and present. She began volunteering at the local high school, teaching a course on marine archaeology. She brought in artifacts from her past expeditions, showed videos of underwater excavations, and talked about the science behind historical preservation.
"The thing about archaeology," she told her students, "is that it's detective work. You're trying to solve puzzles that are hundreds or thousands of years old, using only the clues that have survived." But she also talked about the skills that transferred to other areas of life. Problem solving under pressure, staying calm in dangerous situations, working as part of a team when lives depended on it. "Everything I learned underwater helped me that day on the river," she explained. "But everything I've learned driving a school bus has helped me too. Responsibility, patience, caring about other people's safety, skills build on each other." Some of her students were surprised to learn that their guest teacher was also the bus driver who had made national news. "Why are you still driving a bus?" one teenager asked. "Couldn't you get a better job now?" It was a question Tiffany had been asked many times in the past few months. Her answer had evolved. "What makes a job better?" Tiffany asked back. "More money? More prestige? Or doing something that matters to you?" The student thought about it. "I guess something that matters? Then I already have a better job." I take care of kids every day. I make sure they get to school safely and get home safely. When something goes wrong, I'm prepared to handle it. That matters to me. The school district also asked her to help develop a new emergency response training program for drivers. She worked with local emergency services to create scenarios based on real-world possibilities: severe weather, medical emergencies, equipment failures. The key to emergency response, she told a group of new drivers during a training session, is preparation. You train in calm conditions so you can act effectively in chaotic ones.
She taught them about reading weather conditions, managing stress, making quick decisions under pressure. But she also taught them about the responsibility that came with transporting children. When you put children on your bus, you're making a promise to their parents, she explained. You're saying that you'll bring them home safely. That's not a promise you can make lightly. A year after the flood, the town held a dedication ceremony for the new bridge. It was stronger than the old one, built to withstand much more severe flooding. The ceremony included a memorial for the dramatic rescue that had taken place at the site. Tiffany was invited to speak, but she declined. Instead, she attended quietly, sitting in the back with some of the children from Bus 47 and their families.
The mayor spoke about resilience and community. The fire chief talked about emergency preparedness. A representative from the state transportation department explained the new bridge's safety features. But when the time came for questions from the audience, Emma Martinez raised her hand. "I want to say something about Miss Tiffany," she said, standing up despite her mother's attempts to pull her back down. The crowd turned to look at the 9-year-old girl. "She saved all of us, but that's not why she's special. She's special because she cares about us every single day. Not just when something scary happens, but every morning and every afternoon. She remembers our names and asks about our families and makes sure we're okay. That's what makes someone a hero." The crowd began to applaud, but Emma wasn't finished. "And she taught us that being scared is okay. But you have to know what to do when you're scared. She showed us how to be brave."
The applause grew louder. People began to stand. Soon, the entire crowd was on their feet, clapping not just for what Tiffany had done during the flood, but for what she did every day. Tiffany stood too, not to acknowledge the applause, but to walk over to Emma and give her a hug. "Thank you," she whispered to the little girl. "But you were already brave. You just needed someone to tell you so." The publicity from the rescue had brought Tiffany opportunities she never expected. The National Geographic Society invited her to return to fieldwork, leading a team to explore recently discovered shipwrecks in the Baltic Sea. A television production company wanted to make a documentary about her career transition. Several universities offered her teaching positions with tenure-track possibilities. She turned them all down, but not without serious consideration. "I'm not running away from my past anymore," she told Dr. Chen when he called to discuss the geographic opportunity. "But I'm also not ready to go back to it. Maybe someday. Right now, I'm exactly where I need to be." Driving a school bus, taking care of kids, teaching them that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they need to, showing them that service comes in many forms. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. "You know, Tiffany, what you did that day on the river, that was archaeology too, in a way. How do you figure? You rescued something precious from a dangerous environment and brought it safely to the surface. That's what we've always done. The only difference was that this time, what you rescued was alive." After she hung up the phone, Tiffany sat in her small apartment and thought about that conversation. Maybe she hadn't abandoned her calling after all. Maybe she had just found a different way to practice it.
2 years after the flood, Tiffany received a letter from the Department of Transportation. She had been selected to receive the National School Bus Driver of the Year award, the first time the award had been given primarily for a rescue operation. The ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., and for the first time, Tiffany agreed to travel for an honor. She flew to the Capitol with a delegation that included several of the children from Bus 47 and their families. Standing at the podium in front of an audience of transportation officials, safety experts, and fellow drivers, Tiffany looked out at the crowd and saw Emma Martinez in the front row, now 11 years old and still asking thoughtful questions. "I want to thank everyone for this honor," Tiffany began. "But I want to be clear about something. What I did that day wasn't extraordinary because I used to be an archaeologist. It was extraordinary because it's what any school bus driver would do when their kids are in danger. We don't drive buses because we couldn't do anything else. We drive buses because we want to be part of something important. We want to take care of other people's children as if they were our own. We want to be the first line of safety in their lives. Every day, thousands of school bus drivers across this country make sure that millions of children get to school safely and get home safely. Most of the time, that's routine. But we train for the times when it's not routine, when something goes wrong, when our kids need us to be more than just drivers. I had unusual training for what happened that day. But every school bus driver has the most important training there is. We care about our kids. That's what made the difference. The applause was long and sincere. But when it ended, Emma Martinez stood up and asked a question. "Miss Tiffany, what do you want people to remember about what happened?"
Tiffany smiled at the girl who had taught her as much as she had taught any of her passengers. "I want them to remember that heroes aren't people who do impossible things. Heroes are people who do necessary things, even when they're scared. And sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is show up every day and take care of the people who depend on you." After returning from Washington, Tiffany settled back into her routine. But the recognition had created new opportunities that she couldn't ignore. The state transportation department wanted her input on bus safety regulations. Emergency management agencies invited her to speak at conferences about crisis response. The Coast Guard asked her to help develop water rescue protocols for civilian responders. She accepted the roles that allowed her to stay in Millbrook and keep driving Bus 47. But she approached them with the same methodical care she had once brought to underwater expeditions. "Safety isn't about the equipment," she told a group of new drivers during a training session. "Equipment fails. Safety is about preparation, awareness, and the willingness to act when something goes wrong." She developed scenarios based on her archaeological training. What to do when visibility is poor, how to stay calm when time is running out, how to prioritize when you can't save everyone at once. But she always brought the lessons back to the fundamental truth she had learned as a bus driver. The most important safety feature was caring about the people you were responsible for. "If you care enough," she told the trainees, "you'll find a way to keep them safe. You'll train harder, pay closer attention, and think faster when it matters." 5 years after the flood, Emma Martinez graduated from elementary school. On her last day riding Bus 47, she presented Tiffany with a handwritten letter.
"Dear Miss Tiffany," it read, "thank you for saving our lives, but also thank you for all the normal days. Thank you for remembering my name and asking about my soccer games and making sure I had my backpack. Thank you for teaching me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared. I want to be like you when I grow up. Not an archaeologist or a bus driver, but someone who takes care of people and keeps them safe. Someone who pays attention and is ready when other people need help. You are the best teacher I ever had, even though you never taught in a classroom. Love, Emma." That afternoon, Tiffany sat in the empty bus after finishing her route and read the letter again. She thought about the path that had brought her from the depths of ancient oceans to the everyday responsibility of school transportation. She had started her career believing that importance was measured by the rarity and drama of what you did. Ancient shipwrecks were important because they were old and hard to reach. Archaeological discoveries mattered because they revealed secrets about the past. But Emma's letter reminded her of something different. Sometimes the most important work was the most ordinary work. Sometimes the greatest discoveries were about the present, not the past. Sometimes the most valuable thing you could excavate was trust, and the most precious artifact you could preserve was safety. Tiffany continued driving bus 47 for 3 more years until the school district reorganized routes and her run was eliminated. When they offered her a different route, she surprised everyone by declining. "I think it's time for a change," she told the superintendent. "Are you going back to archaeology?" In a way. The change turned out to be a position with the State Emergency Management Agency, developing water rescue protocols for first responders. Her job was to train firefighters, police officers, and emergency medical technicians in swift water rescue techniques. It was a perfect combination of her archaeological background and her school bus experience. The technical skills from her diving career, combined with the teaching instincts she had developed working with children, made her uniquely qualified to prepare others for emergencies. "The thing about emergency response," she told her trainees, "is that you can't wait until the emergency happens to start learning. You have to train in calm conditions so you can act effectively in chaotic ones." She taught them about reading water conditions, managing fear, making quick decisions under pressure. But she also taught them about the responsibility that came with being someone others depended on. When you put on a uniform, when you take a job where people's safety depends on you, you're making a promise, she explained. You're saying that you'll be ready when they need you. That's not a promise you can make lightly. The training program Tiffany developed became a model for other states. She found herself traveling across the country, teaching her techniques to emergency responders from different agencies and backgrounds.
But no matter where she went, she carried with her the lessons she had learned on Bus 47. The importance of routine preparation, the value of knowing the people you serve, the difference between being ready for emergencies and living in fear of them. 20 years after the flood, Millbrook held a memorial service for the anniversary. The old stone bridge had been replaced by a modern structure, and the town had implemented new flood control measures. But the story of Bus 47 had become part of the community's identity. Tiffany was asked to speak at the service, and this time she agreed. Standing at the podium, looking out at a crowd that included many of the children she had rescued, now adults with children of their own, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment.
20 years ago, I thought my story was about leaving behind one career for another, she began. I thought I was running away from responsibility and danger towards something simpler and safer. But what I learned that day in the river, and in all the days that followed, is that there's no such thing as simple work when you care about the people you serve. There's no such thing as safe when you take responsibility for others' well-being. The children on Bus 47 taught me that heroism isn't about having extraordinary training or facing unusual dangers. It's about being prepared to do what needs to be done when the people you care about need you. Every day, in small ways and large, we all have the opportunity to be heroes for each other. The teacher who stays late to help a struggling student, the neighbor who checks on an elderly friend, the parent who chooses patience over frustration, the bus driver who pays attention to the road and cares about every passenger. What happened 20 years ago wasn't the end of my story or the beginning of a new one. It was just one chapter in a story that all of us are writing together, every day, through the choices we make about how to treat each other and who to be when others are counting on us. In the audience, Emma Martinez, now a teacher herself, smiled and remembered the lessons learned in the third row, right side, of a yellow school bus driven by a woman who had chosen service over glory, routine over recognition, and care over career. After the ceremony, as people gathered for refreshments and conversation, a young school bus driver approached Tiffany. "Miss Davis, I just started driving for the district. Any advice?" Tiffany looked at the young woman and saw herself 30 years earlier, eager to make a difference, but not yet understanding what that really meant. "Pay attention," she said, "to the road, to your passengers, to the weather, to everything. Care about getting everyone home safely. And remember that the most important part of your job isn't the driving. It's the trust." Trust? Every morning, parents put their most precious possessions on your bus and trust you to take care of them. That's not just a job. That's a sacred responsibility. If you remember that, everything else will follow. The young driver nodded seriously, and Tiffany could see that she understood. As the crowd began to disperse, Tiffany walked to the memorial that had been erected near the new bridge. It was a simple stone monument with a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of the courage shown by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they drive school buses." Below that was a list of names. The 23 children from Bus 47, and at the bottom, Tiffany Davis, driver.
But Tiffany knew the real memorial wasn't made of stone and bronze. It was the lives that had been saved, the lessons that had been learned, and the understanding that had grown in a small community about what it really meant to take care of each other. She had started her career in the depths of ancient oceans, searching for traces of civilizations long gone. She had ended it helping people prepare for an uncertain future. But the truth she had discovered along the way was that the most important excavation wasn't about the past or the future. It was about digging deeper into the present moment, finding the courage and compassion that were always there, waiting to be uncovered when they were needed most.
The school bus may have sunk that day 20 years ago, but what rose from those dark waters was something much more valuable than any ancient artifact. The understanding that heroism lives not in grand gestures, but in the daily choice to care for others as if their lives depend on it. Because sometimes they do. Emma Martinez, now doctor. Emma Martinez Rodriguez stood in front of her own classroom of third graders, teaching them about water safety. On the wall behind her desk hung a faded newspaper clipping with the headline, "Bus Driver's Heroic Rescue Saves 23 Children." "Who can tell me what makes someone a hero?" she asked her students. A small boy in the front row raised his hand. "Someone who saves people from danger? That's one kind of hero," Emma agreed. "But there are other kinds too. Sometimes heroes are people who take care of you every single day, who make sure you're safe, who remember your name and ask about your family. Sometimes the most heroic thing someone can do is show up." After school, Emma drove past the new bridge on her way home. She always slowed down at that spot, not out of fear, but out of remembrance. Sometimes she would see Tiffany there, now in her 70s but still strong, still visiting the memorial, still carrying the quiet dignity that had saved 23 lives and changed a community forever. They would wave to each other, teacher to former teacher, survivor to rescuer, friends bound by a moment when ordinary became extraordinary and a school bus driver became a legend. Tiffany had finally learned that you don't have to choose between serving the past and serving the present. Sometimes the most important discovery you can make is that service itself is timeless, and heroism is not about the depth of the water you explore, but about the depth of your commitment to the people who depend on you. In Millbrook, they still tell the story of Bus 47. Parents tell it to their children. Teachers include it in their lessons about courage and community, and every new school bus driver hears it during training. But the story they tell isn't really about a dramatic rescue. It's about what happens when someone chooses to care deeply, prepare thoroughly, and respond bravely when the moment demands it. It's about the truth that Tiffany Davis discovered on a rainy October day, that heroism isn't a career or a calling, it's a choice a choice to pay attention, to take responsibility, to show up every day ready to do whatever needs to be done, too. And sometimes, just sometimes, that choice to care can save the world. Or at least 23 small pieces of it. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below. No.